Katie Sepich thought she was safe, but the nightmare she'd survived was far from over. In the dead of night, her terror grew. The man who had nearly taken her life was still out there, and he wasn't alone. As the walls closed in, Katie's fight for survival reached its breaking point. This isn't just a story. It's a chilling true crime mystery that will leave you questioning, who can you really trust? Stay tuned, because this story is far darker and more twisted than anything you've ever heard before. Don't blink, or you might miss the shocking twist that will change everything. The night was dark, unsettlingly so. A cold wind swept through the streets of Las Cruces, New Mexico. The city was quiet, almost too quiet. Katie Sepich walked home alone, her footsteps echoing in the empty streets. She had just finished a night class at the university. Her mind was on the small things: what to eat, what to wear the next day. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The streetlights flickered above her, casting strange shadows that danced on the cracked pavement. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a brief moment of distraction. But as she pulled it out, something caught her eye. A figure, a man, standing in the dark just beyond the light's reach. He was watching her. Katie quickened her pace, her heart suddenly racing. The air felt thicker, colder. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she moved faster, her shoes slapping against the ground. She could feel him behind her now, his presence like a shadow, hovering too close. With every step, the hair on the back of her neck rose. Her pulse quickened. She dared not turn around, but the sense of danger was overwhelming. Katie's hands shook as she gripped her phone tighter. She should have called someone. Should have made sure someone knew where she was. But it was too late now. The man was closing in. She could hear his footsteps, now just behind her. Closer, closer still. Her breath hitched. And then, in an instant, he grabbed her. A chill shot through her veins. The world around her seemed to blur, the sound of her heartbeat drowning out everything else. Katie fought back, trying to break free. But his grip was too strong, too tight. Her mind screamed for help, but there was no one around. Only the echo of her own panic, her own terror. The man dragged her into the darkness, and all she could hear was the sound of her own breath, quick, shallow, desperate. The street was deserted. The night swallowed their struggle. Katie's vision blurred with tears. The man's hand covered her mouth, suffocating her screams. Her pulse pounded in her ears, louder than anything else. She tried to break free, but her limbs felt heavy, weak. Her heart raced faster than she thought possible. The ground scraped against her skin as he pulled her further. The world seemed to spin around her, disoriented, chaotic. The air smelled of dust and something foul. Katie fought harder, her muscles screaming in protest. Her hands clawed at his grip, her nails digging into his skin. But he didn't loosen his hold. His breath was hot and ragged in her ear. Katie could feel him smiling, relishing the fear he instilled. Every second felt like an eternity. Then, everything went still. A sudden quiet. Katie froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The man stopped pulling her forward. The weight of his body seemed to shift. Was he watching her? Katie's body trembled, but she stayed motionless. She had to find a way out. Her mind raced, trying to think of a way to escape. Her hands found something on the ground. A jagged rock. She gripped it, heart pounding louder. Without warning, she swung it toward him, aiming for his face. A sickening thud. The man recoiled, a sharp cry escaping his throat. Katie bolted. Her legs burned as she ran, the night air cutting through her lungs. Her footsteps were frantic, desperate. She glanced over her shoulder. He was right behind her. She could hear his footsteps, louder now. Closer. Her body screamed for rest, but she pushed herself harder. Her vision blurred, but she didn't dare slow down. She couldn't let him catch her. Then, lights. Bright headlights flooded the street. A car was approaching. Katie's breath came in ragged gasps as she sprinted toward it. She cried out for help, her voice hoarse and weak. The car screeched to a stop just ahead of her. Katie didn't stop. She threw herself at the vehicle, banging on the hood with her fists. The driver's door flew open, but as she reached out to grasp the door handle, she felt a searing pain in her side. A sharp, agonizing twist. Katie screamed, and everything went black. Katie's world spun in darkness. The pain in her side was blinding, unbearable. Her body went limp, collapsing onto the cold pavement. She couldn't breathe. The last thing she heard was the screech of tires as the car sped off into the night. Everything felt distant, like a fading echo. She was alone again. The street, silent, as though nothing had happened at all. Her body trembled, but her mind was a blur. The struggle had drained her, both physically and mentally. She wanted to move, to call for help, but it felt impossible. Her vision flickered in and out, like a broken light. She could still hear the faint sound of footsteps, but they were growing distant.
The man.
Where had he gone? Katie's heart thudded in her chest, each beat slower than the last. She couldn't stay awake, but she fought to hold on. Her eyelids fluttered, struggling to stay open. Minutes, maybe hours passed. Katie wasn't sure. Her breathing was shallow, slow. The world around her felt unreal, as if she were trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Then, a sound broke through the haze, a voice. A man's voice, distant but clear. "Miss, are you okay? Can you hear me?" Katie tried to speak, but nothing came out.
Her throat was raw, dry.
The voice grew closer, and then hands. Warm hands gently lifting her head, cradling it. She felt a sharp sting in her side, a jolt of pain that sent her gasping. The world around her became more defined now.
Shapes, colors,
voices. Someone was kneeling beside her. She blinked, struggling to focus. A paramedic. A woman's voice joined the man's. "We've got to get her to the hospital. She's losing blood fast." Katie's body was lifted. The last thing she saw was the flickering streetlight above, the same one that had cast shadows just hours before. And then darkness again. Underscore 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 underscore. Katie woke in a sterile room. The white walls felt cold, uninviting. Her body ached, each muscle sore and tender. The side where she had been stabbed burned with an intensity that made her flinch. She was hooked up to machines. A soft beep filled the room, steady and constant. Her breath came in shallow gasps, weak but steady. The events of the night rushed back to her. The man. The pain. Her heart skipped a beat. Was he still out there? Katie's mind raced with questions. What had happened to him? Had he been caught? Her fingers trembled as she reached for the 4-line in her arm. She needed answers. But they weren't coming. The door creaked open and a nurse stepped in. She smiled gently, but Katie could see the concern in her eyes. "How are you feeling?" the nurse asked softly. Katie's throat felt tight, but she managed to croak. "What happened? Did they catch him?" The nurse's smile faded. "I'm not sure," she said slowly. "There's been an investigation, but—" Her voice trailed off, as if unsure how much to say. Katie's pulse quickened. "Tell me," she whispered. The nurse hesitated before replying. "We're still waiting for more details, but we believe he's still out there." Katie's heart sank. The darkness from earlier had returned. Katie's chest tightened, her breath catching in her throat. "Still out there." The words echoed in her mind, sending a shiver down her spine. She swallowed hard, the dryness in her mouth unbearable. What do you mean?" Her voice came out strained, barely above a whisper. The nurse looked down, avoiding her gaze. There's not much we can share yet, but it's still an ongoing investigation. Katie's thoughts swirled. She remembered his face, the darkness behind his eyes, the way he had moved, almost predatory. Her body trembled again, despite the warmth of the hospital room. Her fingers dug into the blankets, clutching them tightly as if trying to hold herself together. A sudden, sharp pain stabbed through her side. She gasped, the pain so real it felt like it was happening all over again. The nurse noticed her discomfort and adjusted the foreline. "You're going to be okay," the nurse said gently, her voice almost too soothing. "You're safe now." Katie wasn't so sure. Safe? She didn't feel safe. Her body felt fragile, as if it could crumble at any moment. Her mind replayed every detail of that night, the man's face, the sound of his footsteps closing in. It all felt like a nightmare, but it was real. So real. The nurse moved to leave, but before she could, Katie reached out, her hand shaking. "Do you know anything about him?" Katie's voice was barely audible, filled with fear. "The man who did this to me." The nurse hesitated, glancing toward the door. Then she looked back at Katie with pity in her eyes.
"We don't have much yet," she said softly.
"But there have been other reports, similar cases?" Katie felt her pulse quicken. Other cases? Her breath became erratic, her heart pounding in her chest. "Similar cases?" she asked, her voice hoarse now. The nurse nodded. "It's possible he's done this before. But we don't have confirmation. Not yet." Katie's mind reeled. She wanted answers. She needed them. But as the nurse turned to leave, the door shutting quietly behind her, Katie was left alone with her thoughts. The flickering fluorescent light above seemed to buzz louder in the silence. The darkness from that night loomed over her, suffocating. And just as she closed her eyes, desperate for some peace, she heard it. A noise. A footstep outside her door. Her heart froze. She wasn't alone. Not here. Not anymore. The sound of breathing followed, slow, deliberate. Katie's body tensed. Her heart thudded violently in her chest. She wasn't imagining it. It was real. And the man was still out there. The door creaked ever so slightly. Katie's breath caught in her throat. The footsteps stopped. And then silence. A suffocating silence that filled the room. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Was she imagining it? Her hands gripped the blanket tighter, knuckles white. The air in the room felt thick, heavy. She didn't dare move. The footsteps had stopped, but her fear only intensified. Had they been real? Or was her mind playing tricks on her? She couldn't risk it. Not after everything that had happened. Her eyes scanned the room, darting from corner to corner. Everything was still. She should have called for help. She needed someone. But the silence seemed to press against her chest, choking her. She held her breath, listening intently. Nothing. No sounds. No footsteps. A long moment passed before she allowed herself to breathe again, but the unease remained. Then her door handle shifted. The softest click. Katie's heart leaped into her throat. Her body tensed, her muscles rigid with fear. The door was opening. Slowly. So slowly. A figure appeared in the doorway, just a shadow at first, too faint to make out. Katie's breath hitched. Her body screamed to run, but she was paralyzed. The shadow stepped closer. Closer still. And then it stopped. Katie's eyes strained, trying to make sense of the figure. It was too dark. Too blurry. But one thing was clear. The figure wasn't the nurse. It wasn't anyone she knew. The figure was watching her. A cold chill washed over her. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The figure shifted, stepping fully into the light, revealing a man. Her heart plummeted. It was him. The same man. The one who had attacked her. Her body screamed in panic, but all she could do was stare at him, paralyzed with fear. His eyes were cold, empty. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It was a grin of something darker, something predatory. The room seemed to grow smaller. Katie's mind raced, trying to find a way to escape, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped. He took another step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. A cruel, slow step. Closer, closer. Katie's breath quickened. She couldn't look away. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Katie in the suffocating silence. The door clicked shut behind him. Her chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths. Her skin felt cold, slick with sweat. She had to move, had to do something, but her body wouldn't cooperate. He had been here. He was in the hospital, and he was still hunting her. The realization crashed over her like a wave. He had come for her, and Katie knew this was far from over. Katie lay frozen in her bed, her mind spiraling. She couldn't trust the hospital anymore. She couldn't trust anyone. The feeling of his eyes on her, cold and relentless, burned into her memory. Her body felt as though it were made of stone, too heavy to move. But she couldn't stay like this. She couldn't stay still. Every inch of her being screamed to get out, to escape. Her eyes flicked toward the window, an unfamiliar feeling of dread sweeping over her. It was night again. The moonlight barely pierced through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. Her pulse raced as she strained to listen for any sound. Nothing. Just the soft beeping of machines, the hum of fluorescent lights. But she knew. She knew he was still out there. A sudden noise, a scrape, sounded from the hallway. Katie's heart slammed in her chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The door handle jiggled. Her body went cold. The man was here. She thought she might faint. With every passing second, the air seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as though it were suffocating her. The door creaked open again, just a few inches. Katie squeezed her eyes shut, praying, begging for it to stop. But the door pushed open further. She heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. Katie's heart pounded, wild and desperate. There was no way out. No way to fight him. She gripped the edge of the bed, her fingers digging into the sheets, the pain sharp, grounding. Her breath was shallow now, panicked. The footsteps were closer, closer. And then, the figure appeared in the doorway. Not a man, no, it wasn't him. Not exactly. But it was someone. A nurse. But something was wrong. She couldn't place it at first, but there was something off about the way the nurse stood there. So still, so unnervingly calm. Katie tried to speak, but her throat was dry. The words caught. The nurse took a slow, deliberate step forward. Her face was unreadable. Cold. "Miss Sepich," she said, her voice soft and even but hollow. "Are you feeling all right?" Katie couldn't speak. Her mind was still clouded with fear. The nurse's eyes flicked toward the door, and Katie followed her gaze. Another figure. A dark figure, standing in the shadows just outside the doorway. It was him. Her heart stopped. The nurse's hand shot out, grabbing Katie's wrist with a force that was too strong, too wrong. "No," Katie gasped, trying to pull away. But the nurse only tightened her grip. "You should have stayed quiet," the nurse murmured, her voice now laced with something sinister, something dark. "Now it's too late." Katie's heart thundered in her chest. The truth hit her like a freight train. The nurse, the man in the shadows, they were working together. She wasn't safe. Not here. Not anywhere. Panic surged through her, raw and uncontrollable. With a strength born of desperation, Katie jerked her arm free from the nurse's grasp. She sprang from the bed, her body trembling, her legs unsteady beneath her. The door slammed shut behind her. But there was no escaping now. Katie's heart raced as she stumbled into the hallway, her feet uncooperative. Every step felt like it could be her last. She didn't look back. The door to her room was still closed, but she could feel their presence, closing in on her. She had to get out. She had to get away from them. The hallway stretched out before her, long and empty. The sterile white walls blurred in her vision as the world seemed to tilt. Her breath came in sharp, erratic gasps. She kept her pace steady, forcing her legs to move faster, even though they screamed in protest. Her side throbbed, pain shooting through her body, but she pushed it aside. She couldn't afford to stop now. The emergency exit. It was at the end of the hall, just a few more steps. But as she moved toward it, she saw something that made her stop dead in her tracks. A figure. A shadow in the hallway. The figure was tall, broad-shouldered.
A man.
And there was no mistaking him. It was him again. The same man. Katie's breath hitched. She froze. His eyes locked onto hers, and that same predatory smile curled at the corners of his mouth. He didn't move.
Not yet.
Katie's mind screamed for her to run, but her feet were glued to the floor. His eyes never left her. Closer. He was closing the distance between them. Katie's heart pounded in her ears, the sound deafening. And then, more footsteps. There were more of them now. The nurse. The others. They were all around her.
Trapped.
Her body surged with adrenaline, and with a raw, guttural scream, she pushed herself forward. She ran. Faster. Faster than she ever thought she could. Her legs screamed in agony, but she didn't stop. She reached the emergency exit door and shoved it open with everything she had. Cold night air hit her face like a slap. The world outside was dark, the night wrapped in a thick, oppressive silence. But it didn't matter. She was free. Or so she thought. Her breath was ragged, her vision blurred, but she kept running. She didn't know where she was going, but she didn't care. All that mattered was getting away from them. But then something grabbed her. Strong hands. They were everywhere. The man, the nurse, they were all here. She screamed, but it was swallowed by the night. And then, darkness. Katie's body went limp as the hands yanked her back into the darkness. Her scream faded into the air, unheard, as her mind spun in a haze of terror and confusion. The world around her twisted, the streets, the hospital, all of it blending together, disappearing until nothing made sense. She tried to fight, tried to scream again, but her voice was gone, swallowed by the overwhelming pressure around her. The cold night air no longer felt like freedom. It felt suffocating. The hands, those cold, merciless hands, dragged her through the alley behind the hospital. Her feet scraped against the rough pavement, her knees hitting the ground. But they didn't stop. She couldn't move. She was trapped. No one was around. The streets, usually so full of life, were empty, eerily still. Katie's heart pounded in her chest. Every breath felt like it could be her last. She looked up, her eyes struggling to focus on the faces that surrounded her. The nurse, the man. There were others now, shadows, figures closing in on her from every direction. They had been watching her, waiting. She wanted to fight, to run, but her body was too weak. The pain in her side had returned, sharper now, every movement like a jagged knife. They dragged her to a small, dimly lit van parked in the shadows. The doors slid open with a low creak. A dark interior. Katie's stomach churned as she realized what was happening. They were taking her. Taking her where? She couldn't breathe. They shoved her inside, the cold metal of the van's floor biting into her skin as they forced her down. Her head spun, the world a blur of movement and shadows. The van doors slammed shut, trapping her inside with them. And then the engine roared to life. Katie's heart pounded louder now, almost deafening in the confined space. She struggled to sit up, her hands pressed against the floor of the van, but there was no escape. She tried to focus, to gather enough strength to act, but the pain, the terror, it was all too much. One of them, the man, was seated across from her, his face still hidden in shadow, his eyes glinting in the dim light.
He didn't speak.
He just watched her. Katie could feel her body growing weaker, her mind clouding. Her vision swam. She fought to stay conscious, to hold on to whatever hope remained. But with every passing second, she felt herself slipping further away. Her fingers went numb, the cold creeping up her spine. The van's tires hummed on the road, the sound a dull, rhythmic beat in her ears. And then, just as she thought she couldn't fight anymore, she heard someone. A distant voice. A shout. A car horn. Katie's head snapped up, her mind struggling to make sense of the noise. Was it real? Was someone coming? But the darkness swallowed the sound. The van sped on, faster and faster, the night stretching out before her, endless, unforgiving. The van swerved sharply, jolting Katie awake from the fading fog in her mind. The darkness outside the small window gave no comfort, only more shadows. She had no idea how much time had passed, but her body screamed for rest, for relief from the brutal terror she was caught in. A heavy silence filled the air, thick with anticipation, but Katie refused to let herself slip away. She couldn't afford to. The van was speeding down a winding road now, the tires crunching over gravel, rattling against the uneven ground. Katie's heart raced with every bump, every turn. She tried to push against the floor of the van, using what little strength she had left, but her limbs felt weak and heavy. She couldn't escape this. Then, the sound of the van's engine grew louder, vibrating the walls of the metal box around her. But in that same moment, something caught her attention, a flicker of light from far behind. The headlights of another vehicle, drawing closer at an alarming speed. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be? A chance? A sign? Desperation surged within her. She had to make a move now. The pain in her side was unbearable, but Katie didn't care anymore. She had to act. She braced herself, squaring her shoulders, her mind clouded with a single thought: escape. With a burst of energy, Katie shot up, using the side of the van for leverage. Her limbs screamed in protest, but she kept moving. She reached for the door handle, but it was locked. Her eyes darted to the other figures around her, the man and the nurse still watching her in silence. She had only seconds before they noticed her movements. Katie lunged forward, her heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't think. She couldn't wait. She pulled the handle with all her might, and the door gave. It swung open, releasing a rush of cold air. Her body didn't hesitate. She threw herself out of the moving van. The wind slapped against her face as she tumbled onto the hard road, her body skidding painfully across the gravel. She landed in a heap, gasping for breath, her body racked with pain. But she didn't stop. Not yet. She could hear the van slowing behind her, the tires screeching as it came to a halt. Katie struggled to her feet, her vision blurred by blood and fear, but she kept moving. She ran, stumbling, desperate. The headlights were still on her, a beacon of hope. Someone was coming. Someone was close. She had to hold on. As she rounded a corner, a car appeared before her. A flash of blue and red lights. The police. She had made it. Katie collapsed to the ground, her legs giving out beneath her as the flashing blue and red lights illuminated the darkness. The sound of tires screeching, sirens wailing, filled her ears, but it didn't matter.
She was safe now.
She had made it. Her body was battered and broken, but the sheer weight of relief washed over her. The nightmare was over. The van, the man, the nurse, they were no longer a threat. She had escaped, and now help was here. As the police officers rushed out of the car, Katie barely had the strength to look up. One of them knelt beside her, speaking softly, trying to comfort her as they assessed her condition. But all she could do was nod, too exhausted to speak. She felt the hands of strangers gently lifting her, guiding her to safety. The chaos around her slowed, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to breathe. The ambulance arrived shortly after, its lights flashing, the paramedics rushing to her side. They carefully placed her on a stretcher, and as they wheeled her toward the vehicle, she caught a glimpse of the police officers talking to one another, their faces grim as they examined the van. It was over for the people who had been hunting her. Katie closed her eyes as they drove her away, the hum of the ambulance blending with the sound of her heartbeat. She wasn't sure where they were taking her now, but for the first time in days, the weight on her chest lifted. She was no longer a victim. She was alive. The world outside blurred as they sped toward the hospital, but the danger had passed. She had faced unimaginable fear, pain, and terror, and yet she had found the strength to survive. Her story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And Katie knew, as she drifted into unconsciousness, that she would never be the same. But she had won. She had taken her life back.